Technical difficulties. Sorry about that. H.D. Lewis's Responsibility and Absolute Choice. I think I can read better without that. I'm always yelling at myself through this stupid head. I'm not comfortable with the cans yet. The word responsibility meant, at first, liability to answer. And this carried with it the implication that if the answer was not satisfactory, if we could not give a proper account of our deeds, we were liable to be punished or proceeded against in some way. This is still the meaning of the word in law. To be legally responsible is to be the sort of person who may be punished in certain contingencies. Law and morality. But law is one thing, morality another. We can be vicious in many ways without breaking the law. And history and fiction are full of examples of people who have done abominable things or acted in a mean and detestable spirit while keeping well within the law. We may likewise be legally guilty and morally innocent. This might happen if we broke the law in genuine ignorance of which it would not be practicable to take account, as the courts would normally do. But we may break the law deliberately and deserve high praise for it. Those who disobeyed Nazi laws in our time, preferring to suffer death or brutality in concentration camps, have earned our lasting esteem. Normally, the instrument of reform is persuasion. And where there is proper scope for this, the duty to conform is very high indeed. Law-abiding procedure is usually more important than righting a particular wrong, and no one should forget that to have a right is not the same thing as having a right to insist on that right. If we took the law into our own hands as officials or private citizens, the moment we thought there was injustice, there would be chaos. Appreciation of this and respect for constitutional procedure is an important feature in British tradition and history, and that presents one of the main ways in which we may contribute to world affairs today. We are perhaps a little unmindful of this heritage at present and too prone to resort to unconstitutional methods. In industrial disputes, for example, the moment we think our rights or privileges are endangered. On the other hand, it is impressive how much radical change has been brought about, one might almost say a social revolution, in medical service or the nationalization of industries. For example, despite sharp and indeed bitter opposition on the part of a large section of the community, and yet without violence or disorder. A point may, however, be reached, even in democracies, where the individual must obey his own conscience rather than the law. Each one must finally decide for himself where this point is reached. For the pacifist, it comes if he is asked to fight or to support a war. But no one is morally infallible, neither the majority nor the minority. The lone individual may be a crank or an inspired reformer. There is a right and wrong to our disputes. The truth is there to seek, but no one has an absolute monopoly of it. We have thus to weigh the issue carefully and with much searching of heart before we try the strong medicine of resistance or disobedience. And if we feel impelled to do so, we shall do well to consider the extreme good sense and humility with which Sir Thomas More came reluctantly but bravely to the point of being, quote, the king's good servant, but God's first. It should be added that moral worth will not turn on the soundness of our judgment in these or other matters, but on our integrity and firmness. A person may be outwardly wrong to disobey the law, but inwardly or morally justified. In these ways, then, it becomes plain that law is one thing, morality another. The more the law conforms to ethical standards, the better. But there are many moral matters which it would be foolish to try to enforce by law. Legal responsibility is liability to punishment. Does punishment come into moral responsibility? I should like here to refer to the three main ways in which we usually think of punishment as retributive, reformative, or deterrent. On the retributive view, there is some inherent suitability in punishment. Inherent suitability in punishment. The deed calls for it, for its own sake, as it were. This must not be confused with vengeance, which is for the satisfaction of our own feelings. But even so, and in spite of my regard for the eminent people of today and the past who hold the retributive view, I do not myself see that the situation of wrongdoing is directly improved by the infliction of pain on the offender. I also doubt whether punishment brings about such much genuine reform. The more we can combine with punishment other measures for reform, the better. But these, being allowed books or taught a trade or having visits from the chaplain, are amenities or ameliorations, not part of the punishment proper. The suffering as such may indeed induce a man, quote, to go straight in the future. That is the main point of it. But does it make him genuinely sorry, and how often? I leave this fairly open, but for me, the whole justification of punishment tends to be deterrence. We do not in strictness have to choose between these theories. They are not exclusive, and many still think that all three elements come into punishment. I incline to allow only the factor of deterrence to make it, in famous words, quote, a bad bargain for the offender, unquote, including, of course, would-be offenders. And even if retribution were inherently appropriate, I do not see how one could apply it without knowing a good deal more about one another's hearts than is possible for us or necessary for the inevitable rough and ready business of enforcing the law. Punishment and freedom. Socrates said the same thing, by the way, that retributive justice doesn't make any sense to him either. But anyway, he doesn't think either of those make sense, only deterrence. Let's move on. Punishment and freedom. Many who share this view are apt to take a further step. They observe that we could make good sense of punishment as deterrence even if our conduct were determined. Many who share this view are apt to take a further step. They observe that we could make good sense of punishment as deterrence even if our conduct were determined, provided we were physically free and knew what we were doing, and so on. For the fact that I had to do what I did, being the sort of person I was at the time, would not prevent the punishment I received from affecting my conduct or that of others on some future occasion. We house-train puppies on a similar basis. It is then added that moral responsibility is an essentials like legal responsibility. It also consists in liability to punishment of some sort, and since punishment as deterrence is compatible with determinism, we seem to have here an easy solvent of the old problem of free will. It was, in fact, a pseudo-problem all along. This seems to me gravely mistaken. It implies, as its advocates themselves sometimes stress, that there is no difference between the kleptomaniac and the thief except that the conduct of the thief can be affected by punishment, and this leaves out what matters most about moral accountability. For whether moral guilt calls for punishment or not, that is not the main thing about it. Moral responsibility is prior to punishment, and it calls for a sort of freedom which is not disclosed, but rather obscured by easy assimilation of morality to law. This is best brought out if we consider the sharp distinction we draw between moral and non-moral estimates of worth. Pain is a non-moral evil. You do not think the worse of me if I am in pain. You sympathize with me and help. You rejoice when I am well and happy again. We likewise think it a good thing to be an athlete, or a poet, or a gifted mathematician. We are sorry when people are stupid or inept, but we do not think ill of them or blame them provided they try their best. Few of us understand higher mathematics, but we do not feel guilty on that account. Moral badness in short, is entirely different from any other badness. And moral badness is different from and moral goodness is different from other things also good in themselves. To be a poet or to enjoy poetry is a fine thing, but it is not at all the same sort of fine thing as being a good man. And the root difference here turns on the special freedom we have to be good or bad in the moral sense. There is freedom in art or the attainment of knowledge. Indeed, there are many sorts of freedom, superb in their way. But the freedom which makes us morally good or bad, which gives point to what we say or feel about wickedness, is a freedom of choice, not in the sense of having a certain aptitude, physical or intellectual, but in the sense that we could have done other than we did. Although everything else, including our own nature at the time, were the same. It is an ultimate, absolute choice. Here's his term, absolute choice. The areas of absolute choice. But, you may object, this is absurd. No one has such a choice. We act in character. We rely on one another. And life would be impossible if we did not. I come to the studio to broadcast, expecting the producer, barring accidents, to be there. He expects me and has every reason to assume that, unless I become suddenly delirious, I will give my talk and not break into song or stand on my head in the middle. We do not, in short, expect any action of any man at any time. At any time, right? We don't expect anything. There is obvious continuity of character and conduct. And although we miscalculate at times, we also know very largely what to expect of one another. Free will as absolute choice seems thus absurd. It would be absurd if it meant that we could act out of character at any time and in any regard. That is the absurdity of which the libertarian is often accused. But he is rarely guilty of it, little though his critics today seem to think so. He only holds that there are some respects and some occasions when we have absolute choice. And these are set for us when properly moral matters are involved. If, on the whole, I most want to do one thing, but think it my duty to do something else, then and then only, it seems to me, I have a choice not determined by character or heredity or environment or anything else. I may do my duty or I may not. The possibilities are genuinely and finally open. It is not genuinely open to me to burst into song in the broadcasting studio. Physically, I could, but I have not the slightest urge to make a fool of myself in that way. It is plainly not my duty to do so. In the last resort, being the person I am in these circumstances, I am bound to continue my talk to the end. In different conditions, offered a sufficiently large bribe, I might prefer to sing instead, and I might think it a duty to do so if a sufficiently handsome donation were made in return to some important cause. In the latter case, and perhaps in the first, there would be a real conflict of duty and interest, as there would be, to take a more serious example, if the building were on fire or being bombed and there was reason, as in the war, why the broadcast should continue. I might, in this case, most want to run from danger, and have thus to make a moral effort to resist the temptation to escape and to overcome my fear. It is the choice to make or not make such an effort that is free. And moral worth or disvalue turns on the effort we make or fail to make in situations of this sort, not directly on the outward nature of the action. The conditions in which we exercise choice vary much from one person to another. Some would be less frightened than others, for example, if the building were on fire, or more impressed by possibilities of glory or reward. Only the individual himself knows when the supports are inadequate, when character as a whole and not merely a part is too weak to induce us by nature to act as we should. And when thus only a moral effort can make us do right. I'm sorry. And when thus only a moral effort can make us do right. The temptations of one man are not those of another, or of the same man at some other time. The temptations of Tolstoy were not those of Gandhi. For most of us, stealing is no temptation. Putting it at its lowest, the risks to our jobs and reputations are too obvious. But many people, let's see if that went to sleep, okay. But many people are tempted to steal, and we might be tempted too in some situations. Some people are, again, by nature benevolent and patient, others more sensitive, and so on. And the call of duty upon us will vary much in these ways and according to circumstances. But that we should continue to regard ourselves as responsible beings, liable to have to make excruciating moral choices and not merely be deciding what our preferences are, is of the utmost importance for the worth and dignity of human life as a whole and for the health of society. This is not altered if we find that, for certain practical purposes, all we need consider is the reasonableness of a penalty as a deterrent. Let us, by all means, have enlightened or humanitarian views of the treatment of crime. The moral guilt of the criminal and of all of us in what we do wrong remains. This may be hard to assess, but it must not be overlooked, even in the courts. It would be absurd for a judge in sentencing a criminal to address him as if he were like some unfortunate person who had a highly infectious illness and had to be compulsorily isolated. The criminal has normally brought his punishment on himself by moral as well as legal wrongdoing. He is not just a case to be treated, and it is not for his own good or that of others to think so. The judge is the mouthpiece of the community, and the court, like the pulpit, is a place where the moral quality of conduct is to be upheld and the sense of moral responsibility deepened. But this must be done without smugness or suggesting that crime is the only form of wickedness, nor should it affect the form and degree of the penalty. There are also difficult pathological cases where it is hard to assign responsibility. Perhaps these are not as common as some writers suggest. Most of us are fully accountable most of the time, and whatever we say of hard cases, we need, most of all in times of stress and confusion, to have the sense of ultimate moral responsibility maintained. To this end, we have much to counter in current theology, as well as in social science and psychology. And it is for each one to help in his own way by closer heed to that part of our responsibility which consists in considering carefully where our own precise responsibilities lie. Well, that's what we'll discuss on Tuesday. And I won't anticipate how much of a discussion we'll have on that, but that's what we'll discuss on Tuesday. Thank you.